I want to tell you about a list I never meant to start. It began with a woman named nothing in particular to me. Just another mom at Ethan's preschool pickup, the kind of person you nod at twice a week for 2 years without ever really knowing. She drove a Honda with a cracked taillight she never fixed. She packed the same lunch for her kid every single day: turkey, apple slices, a juice box. No variation, no fuss. And one afternoon, waiting for the same slow line of cars, she mentioned, completely offhand, no pride in it at all, that she and her husband had just paid off their house. Fully. Owned. At 36. I remember sitting in my car afterward, doing the math in my head, and not liking how it came out. She didn't look like someone who owned a house outright. She looked like someone buying the store brand diapers, same as me. And that gap between what she looked like and what she apparently was, that's the thing that actually got under my skin. So I started paying attention, not in any organized way at first, just noticing. And once you start noticing something, you cannot stop seeing it everywhere. Over the next few years, I kept a note on my phone. I still have it. It's embarrassingly unglamorous. Just a list titled, People Who Don't Act Like Their Money. And every time I crossed paths with someone who fit that same pattern, I'd add them to it. A woman from my old job who mentioned, years after she'd left, that she and her partner were financially independent in their 40s. My cousin's mother-in-law, who I found out almost by accident had been quietly running a 7-figure retirement account for a decade. A neighbor, a former client of my husband David's, a woman I met exactly once at a birthday party who said one sentence about her investments that I thought about for a week afterward. By this past spring, the list had 30 names on it. 30 people, almost none of whom knew each other, almost none of whom had ever said the word wealthy out loud about themselves, almost none of whom looked, dressed, drove, or spent like what I'd always pictured when I pictured someone with money. I want to be honest about something before I go any further, because I think it matters. I'm not a researcher. I don't have a background in finance, and I didn't approach any of these 30 people with a clipboard or a formal question. Most of them have no idea they're even on a list. The details I collected came from years of ordinary conversation, the kind that happens at pickup lines and birthday parties and family dinners, where someone mentions something offhand and you happen to be paying attention. This isn't a study in any official sense. It's closer to what happens when you finally start noticing a pattern that was always there, hiding in plain sight, in the ordinary people already around you. The same way you suddenly start seeing a certain model of car everywhere once you've considered buying one yourself. What made me trust the pattern enough to actually build this whole video around it wasn't any single person's story. It was how unrelated these 30 people were to each other, and how consistently the same handful of things kept showing up anyway. A woman in her 60s and a woman in her 20s, on opposite ends of my list, described almost the identical habit in almost the identical words, without ever having met. That kind of quiet repetition, across people who share nothing else in common, is exactly the kind of thing that made me start paying closer attention instead of writing it off as coincidence. And once I actually sat down and read through the whole list side by side, the little details I jotted next to each name, the offhand comments, the things I'd noticed about how they actually lived, I started seeing the same handful of things again and again. Not identical stories. Different jobs, different incomes, different family situations, different starting points. But underneath all of that, the same 8 things kept showing up, over and over, in person after person, like they'd all read the same book nobody had ever handed me. I'm Alora, and this is the Finance Mom HQ, where we talk about the money stuff nobody ever actually sits moms down to explain. Today, I want to walk you through all 8 of those things, the way I actually found them, not as a tidy checklist, but as the real, specific pattern that kept repeating across 30 completely different lives. Because once you see it laid out, I think you'll recognize pieces of it in people you already know too. And more importantly, I think you'll see exactly where you can start. Before I get into the list, I want to name the thing that ties all 8 of these together, because it changes how you'll hear everything else I'm about to say. None of these 30 people got there by earning some enormous, unreachable income. A few did make a lot of money, sure, but most of them didn't. What they had in common wasn't the size of their paycheck. It was a set of quiet, almost boring decisions about how they related to money. Decisions that had nothing to do with willpower or sacrifice, and everything to do with information. They simply knew things about their own financial lives that most of us have never bothered to find out. And once you know those things, the decisions that follow get a lot easier to make. That's really the whole thread. Not earn more, not want less. Just know more about your own situation than you currently do, and let that knowledge quietly steer you. Keep that in mind as we go, because every single one of these 8 things comes back to it. There's one more thing worth naming before we start, because I think it's the part most of these kinds of lists leave out. None of these 8 things happened as a single decision made once. Every single person on my list describes something closer to a small system, a habit repeated on a schedule, automated where it could be automated, checked in on periodically rather than agonized over daily. Nobody I spoke to described white-knuckling their way through willpower every single day for years. That's not sustainable for anyone, and none of these 30 women would have kept any of this up for a decade if it had required that kind of constant effort. What they built instead were small, boring routines, a monthly number to check, a yearly phone call to make, a weekly line to write. Routines specific and small enough that they eventually stopped requiring any motivation at all. They just became the thing that Tuesday, or the 3rd of the month, or Sunday evening meant. That's the real shape of everything you're about to hear. Not a single leap. A series of small, repeated, almost forgettable actions, done consistently enough for long enough that they added up to something none of these women could have built any other way. The first thing every single person on my list had in common is that they knew their exact net worth, down to a real number, and they could tell you what it was without having to go check. This one surprised me the most, honestly, because I didn't expect it. I assumed wealthy acting people tracked their income closely, how much came in each month, how the raises stacked up over the years. But income wasn't the number any of them mentioned. It was net worth, what they owned, everything, minus what they owed, everything. And they knew it the way you know your own age. Here's why that distinction actually matters so much. Income is a number that resets every single month. It tells you almost nothing about your actual financial position. You can earn a huge income and still be worth less than 0 once your debts are counted. And plenty of people do exactly that. Net worth is the only number that actually tells the truth about where you stand, because it accounts for everything at once. The house, the car loan, the retirement account, the credit card balance, all of it, netted against each other into one honest figure. Most of us have never actually calculated our own net worth, not once. We know roughly what we make. We have a vague sense of whether we're doing okay, but we couldn't tell you the real number if you asked us on the spot, because we've never sat down and added it all up. The woman from my old job, the one who told me years later that she and her partner were financially independent, she said something I've never forgotten. She said she started calculating her net worth every single month, back when it was a genuinely humiliating number, deep in the negative, mostly from student loans and a car she'd financed badly in her 20s. She kept calculating it anyway, every month. Watching a bad number is uncomfortable, but she said watching it slowly get less bad month over month was the first time managing money ever felt like something she was actually doing, instead of something that was happening to her. I decided to try this myself the week after that conversation with her, more out of curiosity than anything else. I sat down with David one Sunday night after the kids were asleep, and we actually added it all up. The house equity, what was left on the mortgage, our retirement accounts, our savings, the car loan, everything. It took maybe 40 minutes, and I remember feeling genuinely nervous beforehand, the same way you feel nervous stepping on a scale after avoiding it for months. The number that came out wasn't dramatic in either direction, but just having it, just knowing it instead of guessing at it, changed something. I've calculated it every quarter since, and every single time it tells me something my monthly income never could. I want to explain the actual mechanics of this a little more, because I don't think know your net worth means much until you understand why it works better than every other number we're taught to watch. Your income is what accountants would call a flow. Money moving past you for 1 month, then gone, replaced by next month's flow, telling you almost nothing about what's accumulating behind it. Your net worth is a stock, a single snapshot of everything you've built or owe, at rest, at one moment in time. A high income with a flow problem can sit on top of a genuinely bad net worth for years without anyone noticing, including the person living it, because the monthly number always looks fine even while the underlying position quietly rots. A modest income with good net worth habits does the opposite. It looks unremarkable every single month, right up until the stock underneath it has quietly become something real. A woman 2 doors down from us, someone on my list I haven't mentioned yet, told me about the first time she calculated hers, back when she and her husband were both working retail jobs in their early 20s. She said the number came out at almost exactly negative $11,000, mostly credit card debt and one bad car loan. And she remembers being embarrassed enough that she almost didn't tell her husband the exact figure. But she calculated it again 3 months later anyway, out of stubbornness more than optimism, and it had moved. Not dramatically, maybe $800 in the right direction, but it had moved, and that alone was enough to make her do it again the month after that. She's calculated it every single month for 11 years now, the same stubborn habit, and she told me the number crossed 0 for the first time around year 4, and crossed 6 figures, positive, sometime last year. She said nobody who knew her from that first retail job would believe it, because nothing about how she lives has changed enough for anyone to notice from the outside. That's really the mechanism underneath this whole pattern. Net worth is the one number that can't lie to you the way income can, because it forces every asset and every debt into the same honest room at the same time. Once you're actually tracking it, even loosely, even just once a quarter instead of monthly like the woman 2 doors down, you start making different decisions almost automatically, because you can finally see, in real numbers, exactly what any given choice does to the one figure that actually matters. This week, if you've never done this, I want you to actually sit down and do it. Every account you have, savings, checking, retirement, home equity if you own, add it up. Every debt you owe, mortgage, car loan, credit cards, student loans, subtracted. Write the real number down somewhere private. You don't have to tell anyone. You don't have to like it. You just have to know it. The second thing on the list is that every single one of them negotiated things quietly and constantly, almost as a reflex, in places most of us never think to even try. I want to be specific about what I mean, because negotiate sounds intimidating, like something that requires a special personality. It doesn't. What I actually saw, over and over, was people asking simple questions in ordinary moments. Questions the rest of us just don't think to ask, because we've been trained to treat prices as fixed even when they quietly aren't. My cousin's mother-in-law, the one with the 7-figure retirement account nobody would have guessed at, told me once, almost as a throwaway comment, that she calls her internet provider every single year and asks what promotions are available for existing customers. Every year. Same call, 5 minutes, and it saved her real money for over a decade. Not because she's some negotiating expert, because she simply decided the 5-minute call was worth making every year without exception. Here's the misconception I think trips most of us up. We picture negotiating as this high-stakes, adversarial thing, haggling over a car, arguing with a stranger, something that requires confidence most of us don't feel we have. But almost everything this group negotiated was low stakes and routine. Insurance premiums, medical bills, the interest rate on a credit card, just by calling and asking. Even things like a hotel rate or a gym membership fee. None of it required confrontation. It just required asking a simple question that most people never bother to ask, because we've absorbed this idea that prices are just prices. The woman I met once at that birthday party, the one whose single sentence I thought about for a week, mentioned that she'd called her medical billing department after a hospital stay and simply asked if there was a self-pay discount available. There was. Nearly 40% off the remaining balance, just for asking a question that took 30 seconds to say out loud. I tried this myself for the first time with our cable bill, of all things, feeling a little silly about it the whole time I was on hold. I said almost exactly what she'd described, asked if there were any current promotions for existing customers, said I was thinking about switching providers if not. The answer was yes, there absolutely was, and it dropped our bill by $22 a month, every month, for calling and asking one question I'd simply never thought to ask in 4 years as a customer. $22 a month sounds small. Over 10 years, at even a modest rate of return if you invested it, instead of just letting it sit, that one phone call is worth thousands of dollars, and it cost nothing but 5 minutes and a willingness to ask. Here's the part that took me a while to understand, and I think it's worth explaining because it's the reason this works far more often than people expect. Most companies that bill you every month, internet providers, insurance companies, even some medical billing departments, have real budgets set aside specifically for keeping existing customers instead of losing them to a competitor. Because acquiring a brand new customer almost always costs the company more than quietly discounting an existing one. That discount isn't a secret favor. It's a line item that already exists, sitting there, waiting for someone to actually ask for it. The company would rather quietly give you 20% off than have you cancel entirely. And the only reason most of us never receive that discount is that we never ask the one question that unlocks it. My sister-in-law, who's on my list too, told me about doing this with her health insurance premium of all things, something I genuinely didn't know was ever negotiable. She'd had a small gap in coverage after a job change, and instead of just accepting the new enrollee rate she was quoted, she called and asked, plainly, whether there was any flexibility given her prior coverage history. There was. Not a huge amount, but enough to matter over a year. She told me she's applied the same instinct to nearly everything recurring in her life since then. Her gym, her phone plan, even the annual fee on one of her credit cards, which the bank waived entirely the one time she called and asked if it could be waived for loyalty, rather than her just quietly paying it every year the way she had for the 3 years before that. What struck me most, hearing these stories back to back, is that almost none of these women describe themselves as good negotiators. Not one of them talked about it as a skill they developed or a personality trait they were born with. Every single one described it as a decision to ask the question instead of silently assuming the answer would be no, made over and over, small bill after small bill, until it stopped feeling like a big deal to ask at all. This week, pick one recurring bill. Internet, insurance, a subscription, anything. And just call and ask what's available. You don't need a script. You don't need to be tough about it. Is there anything you can do on this bill? Is a complete sentence, and it works far more often than you'd expect. The third thing every one of them shared is that they treated their own time as something with a real dollar value, and it quietly changed what they said yes and no to. This is probably the most abstract item on the list, but stay with me, because once it clicked for me, I started seeing it behind almost every other decision this group made. Here's the idea in its simplest form. If you know roughly what your time is worth, either what you actually earn per hour or what you could earn if you spent that hour differently, you start evaluating decisions differently. Not every decision, but the ones that quietly cost you hours without you noticing. A former client of David's, a woman who ran a small business out of her house for years before selling it, told him something that stuck with him enough that he repeated it to me. She said she stopped doing anything herself that she could reasonably pay someone else to do for less than her own hourly rate, and started doing more of the things that only she could do, the ones that actually grew her business or her family's life in a way nobody could outsource. She wasn't talking about luxury. She was talking about things like driving 40 minutes across town to save $8 on groceries, when that same 40 minutes spent differently was worth far more than $8 to her. The misconception here is that this sounds like an excuse to be lazy or to avoid anything inconvenient. It isn't that at all. It's the opposite of laziness, actually. It's being deliberate about where your limited hours go, instead of spending them on autopilot without ever asking whether a different use of that same hour would be worth more. I noticed this pattern again with the neighbor on my list, a woman who works part-time and has 3 kids close in age to mine. She told me once that she pays a neighborhood teenager to do the grocery pickup for her every week. Not because she can't do it herself, but because she calculated that the $20 a week she pays him is worth less to her than the 90 minutes she gets back, which she spends, without exception, on either rest or something with her kids that she'd otherwise be too depleted to enjoy. I started applying this in a small way myself last year, when I stopped trying to save money by doing our own oil changes and basic car maintenance, something my dad taught me, and that I'd always taken a strange pride in doing myself. The math, once I actually did it, wasn't close. I was spending close to 2 hours doing something a shop down the street does in 20 minutes for $40. $40 that, compared to what those 2 hours were actually worth to me as a mother of 2, wasn't a hard call once I let myself see it that way. The actual calculation is simpler than it sounds, and I want to walk through it plainly because I think most of us have never done it even once. Take your real take-home pay for a year and divide it by the actual number of hours you spend earning it. Not just the hours on the clock, but the commute, the unpaid prep, all the invisible hours a job actually costs you. That number, once you have it, becomes a kind of exchange rate for every hour you spend afterward, at work or away from it. Once you know your real hourly rate, you can ask an honest question about almost any task in your life. Does doing this myself save me more than an hour of my own time is actually worth? Or am I just avoiding the discomfort of paying someone else to do it? The woman from Ethan's old swim class, another name on my list, described almost the identical realization, but from the opposite direction. She started saying yes to more paid work, not less, once she ran this same math. She'd been turning down a few hours of freelance design work every month because it felt like too much on top of an already full schedule, until she sat down and compared what that freelance hour actually paid against what she was otherwise doing with that same hour, which was mostly low-value tasks around the house that she could have paid someone $15 or $20 to handle instead. Once she saw the gap in black and white, she started saying yes to the freelance hours and paying for a few of the household tasks instead, and the net effect over a year was several $1,000s she wouldn't have otherwise had, simply from routing her actual hours toward whichever side of that trade paid better. The mistake most of us make, I think, is treating every hour of our day as if it has the same value, when it clearly doesn't. An hour spent on something only you can do, being present with your kids, doing the one task at work that actually moves your career forward, resting enough to function the next day, is worth something completely different than an hour spent on a task literally anyone could be paid a modest wage to do instead. Once you can see that difference in real numbers, instead of just a vague feeling that you're too busy, the decisions get much easier to make. This week, I want you to think of one thing you do regularly that costs you real time for very little real savings. And ask yourself honestly what an hour of your life is actually worth to you right now. You don't have to change anything yet. Just do the math once and see what it tells you. If any of this is landing so far, I want to tell you quickly why this channel even exists. I started it because I wanted to reach as many moms as I possibly could. Moms nobody ever sat down and actually explained this stuff to, the way nobody sat me down either. Every single person who subscribes brings me one mom closer to that. So if this is useful, hit subscribe, because we've still got 5 more things on this list to go, and I promise the next few are the ones that genuinely surprised me most. The 4th thing on the list is that every one of them drew a hard line between looking wealthy and being wealthy, and they consistently chose being over looking, even when nobody was watching to notice the difference. This is the pattern that first got me started on this whole list. If you remember the woman from preschool pickup with the cracked taillight and the paid-off house. And once I started looking for it specifically, I saw it in almost every one I'd written down. The misconception most of us carry, I certainly carried it, is that the visible signs of money and the actual presence of money are the same thing, or at least closely related. They're not. Spending on things that signal wealth and actually building wealth are, more often than not, competing uses of the exact same dollars. Every dollar spent making your life look a certain way to other people is a dollar that isn't doing anything else. And this group, almost without exception, chose to spend that dollar somewhere invisible instead. The woman from my old job put it in a way I still think about. She said that somewhere in her late 20s, she noticed she was making financial decisions based on what she imagined other people would think if they saw her car, her clothes, her apartment. And once she noticed that, she started asking a different question before any bigger purchase. Would I still want this if literally nobody else ever saw it? She said the answer was no, far more often than she expected. And every time the answer was no, that was money that went somewhere else instead. Usually somewhere nobody would ever see either, which was exactly the point. I felt this one personally, if I'm honest. There was a stretch a few years back where I cared, more than I wanted to admit, about how our house looked when other moms came over for playdates. Cared enough that I put real money into things that had nothing to do with how our family actually lived day to day, and everything to do with a version of us I imagined other people were judging. I don't think I even fully realized I was doing it until I looked back at that spending later and couldn't explain most of it except as exactly that. Once I actually meant what I was doing, it got much easier to stop. Not because I became a different person overnight, but because naming the impulse made it visible enough to catch in the moment instead of acting on it without noticing. There's a real psychological mechanism behind why this particular trap catches so many of us. and understanding it helped me more than just willpower ever did. Economists call it conspicuous consumption, spending specifically calibrated to be seen and interpreted by other people, rather than spending calibrated to your own actual life. The trouble is that this kind of spending is almost invisible to the person doing it, because it never announces itself as spending to look wealthy. It just shows up disguised as 100 smaller, individually reasonable-sounding decisions. The nicer car because the old one felt embarrassing in the school pickup line, the bigger house because friends had bigger houses, the vacation posted at the exact moment other people were also posting theirs. None of those decisions feel irrational in the moment. They only reveal their true shape once you add them all up and ask what they actually bought you, versus what that same money could have quietly built instead. The client of David's, the one who later sold her small business, told him about a specific moment that reframed this for her permanently. She'd been eyeing a significantly nicer car for months, one that fit the image she had of what a successful small business owner should be driving to meetings. Right before she bought it, on something close to a whim, she asked herself whether she'd still want that exact car if she were going to park it in a garage and never drive it anywhere anyone she knew would see it. She said the honest answer was immediate and a little uncomfortable. No, not really, not for that price difference. And she kept her existing car for another 4 years instead, putting the difference into her business. She told David that single question became something close to a permanent filter for her after that, applied almost automatically to anything with a big price tag and a visible to other people component. What I think is easy to miss is that this isn't really about deprivation at all. Every single person on my list still spent real money on things that mattered to them, just overwhelmingly on things nobody else would ever see or know about. Retirement contributions nobody congratulates you for. An emergency fund nobody claps for. The difference isn't how much they spent. It's simply which side of that line, visible or invisible, most of their spending ended up landing on, once they started noticing which side they were choosing. This week, before any non-essential purchase, I want you to ask yourself that exact question. Would I still want this if nobody else would ever see it? You don't have to act differently based on the answer every time. Just start noticing how often the honest answer surprises you. The fifth thing every one of them had was what I started calling a regret log instead of a budget. A running, honest record of purchases they wished they hadn't made, which they actually used, instead of a strict spending plan they mostly ignored. I want to explain why this distinction matters, because it took me a while to understand it myself. A budget tells you what you're allowed to spend before you spend it. A regret log tells you the truth about what you actually regret after you've already spent it. And it turns out that second kind of honesty is far more useful for actually changing behavior than the first kind of restriction. The neighbor with the 3 kids close in age told me she tried strict budgets for years and always abandoned them within a month or two. The same story most of us know well. What actually worked for her was different. A simple running note where, once a week, she'd write down anything she'd bought that week that she genuinely regretted, even a little, and one honest sentence about why. Not as punishment, just as information. Here's what she found after doing this for about 6 months. The same handful of categories kept showing up over and over. Things she bought when she was exhausted at the end of the day, things she bought to avoid a small conflict with one of her kids in the moment, things she bought because an app made it frictionless to buy them without really deciding to. Once she could see the pattern clearly, written out in her own handwriting week after week, she didn't need a budget to stop doing those specific things. She just stopped because she could finally see exactly what she was doing and why, instead of feeling vaguely bad about spending in general without ever locating the actual source. I started my own version of this after that conversation, and it was uncomfortable in a genuinely useful way. My own pattern, once I could see it laid out over a few months, was almost entirely late evening purchases. Small stuff, $10 or $15 at a time, bought on my phone after the kids were finally asleep, and I was too tired to cook or clean or do anything productive, but somehow not too tired to shop. Seeing that pattern in black and white, week after week, did something a budget never managed to do for me. It made the behavior visible enough that I started catching myself mid-scroll, most nights, before I actually bought anything. I want to explain why this particular tool works better than a budget for so many of us, because I don't think it's obvious, A budget is a restriction imposed in advance, based on a guess about what you'll want in the future. And restrictions imposed on a guess tend to break the moment real life doesn't match the guess, which is most of the time. A regret log is the opposite. It's collected evidence gathered after the fact about what you actually did and how you actually felt about it. And evidence is much harder to argue with than a rule because it's not someone else's plan for your life. It's your own honest record of your own actual behavior, which makes it almost impossible to rationalize away the way we all rationalize away a budget category we've decided doesn't really count this week. A friend of mine from before the kids, someone else who ended up on my list, described a completely different pattern once she started her own version of this. Hers wasn't late evening scrolling at all. Hers was almost entirely purchases made in the 10 minutes right after an argument with her teenager. Small treats and impulse buys that she now understood, looking back at months of entries, were really an attempt to feel some sense of control in a moment that otherwise felt completely out of her hands. She told me that once she could see that specific pattern laid out in her own handwriting, she started catching the urge in the exact moment it appeared. And instead of buying something, she'd go for a short walk instead. Not as some grand self-improvement plan, just as the thing she'd learned, from her own evidence, actually worked better for her than the $10 candle did. That's really the deeper value of this whole habit. It's not really about the money in any single entry. Most regret log purchases are small, individually forgettable amounts. It's about what the pattern reveals over time, which a single month's budget spreadsheet could never show you, because a budget only tells you what category the money left from. A regret log tells you why it left in the first place, and once you know why, the actual fix is usually much smaller and much more specific than spend less. I think this is worth sitting with for a second, because it reframes something most of us have been taught to feel ashamed of. A budget failure feels like a character flaw. You set a limit. You broke it. The story you tell yourself is that you lack discipline. A regret log entry doesn't ask you to feel that way about yourself at all. It just asks you to notice, without judgment, and write down one honest sentence. That small shift, from judging yourself to simply observing yourself, turns out to matter enormously for whether people actually keep doing this for months instead of quitting after a week the way most of us quit a budget. Every single woman on my list who described this habit used almost identical language for it. Not a diet for their spending, just a mirror. This week, just start. One line, once a week, about anything you bought that you wish you hadn't, and one honest sentence about why. Don't judge it yet, just collect it. The pattern will show itself faster than you expect. The sixth thing on the list is that every single one of them kept exactly one financial goal loud and public, while keeping everything else about their money quiet and private. This one felt almost contradictory to me at first, given everything else on this list has been about staying quiet. But it wasn't actually a contradiction once I understood what it was doing. The client of David's, the one who sold her small business, told him she'd always kept one goal genuinely public, something she'd tell friends and family about openly, whether that was paying off a specific debt or hitting a specific savings target. But everything else about her finances, every other number, stayed completely private, discussed with almost no one outside her own household. The reason this works, once you think it through, is that one public goal gives you real accountability. People ask how it's going, which keeps you honest and motivated in a way that a private goal never quite manages to. But keeping everything else quiet protects you from the comparison and judgment that tends to creep in the moment other people know your full financial picture. You get the motivating power of being seen, without the corrosive effect of being fully exposed. My cousin's mother-in-law described almost the identical pattern, though she used different words for it. She told a small group of close friends years ago that she was working toward paying off her mortgage by a specific age. She named the number out loud to people who'd check in on it. But her actual retirement account balance, the one that turned out to be worth 7 figures, was something almost nobody in her life knew about until she mentioned it to me, practically by accident, at that birthday party where I first heard about her. I tried this myself last year with our own emergency fund goal. Told a couple of close friends specifically that we were trying to build 3 months of expenses saved by a certain date, and let them check in on it periodically. It worked exactly the way it's supposed to. Having people who'd occasionally ask, "How's the fund going?" kept it real in a way that a private goal, one I could quietly abandon without anyone noticing, never would have. There's a real name for what's actually happening here, and understanding the mechanism made me trust the strategy a lot more than I did at first. Behavioral researchers call it a commitment device, a way of using other people's attention, which you can't fully control or ignore, to keep yourself honest about a goal in a way pure private intention almost never manages on its own. When a goal lives only in your own head, abandoning it costs you nothing but a quiet, private disappointment that's easy to talk yourself out of feeling. When even one other person knows the specific goal and might ask about it, abandoning it now costs you an actual conversation you'd rather not have. And that small, real social cost turns out to be a surprisingly powerful reason to keep going on nights when your own motivation alone wouldn't have been enough. The woman 2 doors down, the one with the $11,000 negative net worth that eventually turned positive, told me she used this exact mechanism years ago around paying off her one bad car loan specifically. She told her mother, and only her mother, the exact remaining balance and the month she was targeting to have it gone. And her mother asked about it, without fail, nearly every time they talked for the better part of a year. She said there were multiple months where the only reason she didn't quietly skip an extra payment was knowing her mother would ask about the balance the following Sunday, and she didn't want to have to explain why it hadn't moved. What I think matters most here is being deliberate about which goal gets that spotlight and which numbers stay private. You're not trying to become an open book about your finances generally. Most of the other 7 things on this list depend on you not doing that. You're choosing exactly one goal on purpose, to expose to just enough outside pressure to keep yourself honest, while everything else about your financial life stays exactly as private as you want it to be. I also think it matters which goal you pick for this, because not every goal benefits equally from an audience. The goals that seemed to work best for the people on my list were ones with a clear number and a clear finish line, a specific debt gone, a specific dollar figure saved, a specific date attached to either. Vaguer goals, the kind without a real number attached, don't give the people checking in on you anything concrete to ask about, and they don't give you anything concrete to report back either, which quietly drains the whole mechanism of its power. I'm trying to save more is a goal almost nobody will remember to ask about in 6 months. I'm trying to have $4,000 saved by my birthday is a goal your sister will actually remember and actually ask about in a way that keeps you honest in exactly the way this pattern depends on. This week, pick one goal, just one, and tell 1 or 2 people you trust about it specifically enough that they could actually check in on your progress later. Keep everything else about your money exactly as private as you want it to stay. The 7th thing every one of them had was a small group of people in their life who talked about money the way you talk about the weather, openly, casually, without shame or performance. And they'd built that group on purpose. This is the one I think about most now because it's the hardest one to just decide to do on your own. You can calculate your net worth alone tonight if you wanted to. You cannot build an entire social circle alone tonight. This one takes time. But here's what I noticed once I looked for it. Almost every person on my list of 30 had at least 1 or 2 people in their life. A friend, a sibling, a partner, sometimes a whole small group, who they could talk to honestly about money without it turning awkward or competitive. Real numbers, real mistakes, real questions asked out loud to people who wouldn't judge or gossip about the answer. The woman from preschool pickup, the one who started this whole list, mentioned once that she and 2 other moms from a mom's group she'd been part of for years had an unspoken rule that money could be talked about honestly among the 3 of them. Actual numbers, actual struggles, actual wins, in a way none of them discussed with almost anyone else. She said having even that small circle changed how she thought about money generally, because she wasn't carrying every financial decision alone in her own head, second-guessing herself with no outside perspective at all. Most of us don't have this. Money is one of the last real taboos. We'll discuss almost anything else more openly than our actual financial situation. And the silence isn't neutral. It leaves each of us reinventing the wheel alone, making the same avoidable mistakes other people around us have already made and could have warned us about, if only the topic weren't so sealed off. I started trying to build a small version of this myself over the past year or so, mostly by simply being the first one to bring up a real number in conversations where I used to stay vague. It's slow. It's a little uncomfortable at first, but every single time I've done it, the other person has met that honesty with their own, and the conversation has been worth more than the discomfort cost. I think it's worth explaining exactly why this silence costs us so much, because it's easy to treat it as just an awkward social norm, rather than something with a real financial cost attached. When nobody around you talks honestly about money, every single mistake gets made in isolation, over and over, by different people who could have warned each other but never did, simply because the topic stayed sealed off. The interest rate someone overpaid on a car loan because they didn't know to shop it around. The fee someone paid for years on an account because they never heard a friend mention that a fee-free version existed. None of these mistakes are rare. They're just quiet, repeated separately inside thousands of households that never once compared notes with each other. My sister-in-law described this shift happening for her almost by accident through a small book club that had nothing to do with money at all. 4 women who met monthly to discuss whatever novel they'd picked, until one evening someone mentioned, almost as an aside, a specific mistake she'd made with a retirement account rollover that had cost her real money. Instead of the conversation going quiet the way money talk usually does, 2 of the other 3 women admitted they'd made variations of the exact same mistake, and the 4th admitted she didn't fully understand what a rollover even was. That one accidental conversation turned into an ongoing, unofficial habit. Money came up naturally now, woven into the same conversations as the books, and every one of them told me they'd caught or avoided a real mistake at some point, specifically because someone else in that small group had mentioned it first. You don't need a formal group or a big circle for this to work. Even one honest relationship, a sibling, a close friend, a partner, where real numbers can be said out loud without judgment, does most of the work. The size of the circle matters far less than whether it exists at all. This week, I want you to try being the first one to say a real number out loud to one person you trust. What you actually make, what you actually owe, a real goal you're working toward. See what comes back. The 8th and final thing every single person on my list shared is that they let the small, boring wins count as much as the big, dramatic ones, and it kept them going in a way pure willpower never could have. I saved this one for last because it's less a strategy and more the thing that made all the other 7 possible to sustain over years, not just weeks. Nobody on my list describes some single dramatic turning point, no windfall, no overnight transformation. What they described, again and again, was a long string of small, almost embarrassingly boring wins that most people would never think to celebrate at all. Finding the $22 on a phone call, watching a negative net worth number get slightly less negative 1 month at a time. Catching one late-night impulse purchase before it happened instead of after. The client of David said something about this that I still think about. She said, the version of herself who expected one big win eventually gave up over and over because the big win never seemed to come fast enough to justify the effort. The version of herself who learned to feel genuinely proud of a $20 win was the version who actually stuck with any of this long enough for it to compound into something real. I felt this shift in myself over the past year of keeping this list and trying these things. The $22 from the cable call didn't feel like nothing to me. It felt like a genuine win, the same week I made it. And that feeling is honestly a big part of why I kept going and tried the next thing and the thing after that. There's a real reason this works better than waiting for one big win, and it comes down to how habits actually get built in the first place, not how we wish they got built. Any behavior that only gets rewarded once, far off in some uncertain future, is a behavior that's genuinely hard for most brains to sustain, because there's nothing pulling you forward in the meantime except willpower alone. And willpower is a famously unreliable fuel. We already talked about that back at the very start of this list. A behavior that gets a small, real, immediate acknowledgement, even something as simple as letting yourself feel good for a night about $22, creates its own fuel, over and over, which is exactly why it can outlast a strategy that's technically smarter on paper, but depends on discipline nobody can maintain for years without a single win along the way. The woman from Ethan's old swim class, the one who started saying yes to more freelance hours once she ran the real math on her time, told me she kept a small note of her own, not a regret log this time, but the opposite, a a running list of every small win, no matter how minor. The negotiated bill, the freelance hour she almost turned down, the month her net worth moved in the right direction, even though the number was still technically bad. She said rereading that list on a hard month, when nothing felt like it was working, did more to keep her going than any single big number ever could have, because it was proof, in her own words, that the boring stuff was actually working, even when it didn't feel dramatic enough to notice in the moment. I think that's the real secret hiding underneath all 30 names on my list, more than any single one of the 8 things individually. None of them were waiting to feel motivated before they acted. They'd simply arranged their own lives so that acting felt good enough, often enough, in small enough doses, that motivation stopped being the thing they needed in the first place. I want to say one more thing about this, because I think it's easy to hear celebrate the small wins and assume it means something soft, something that doesn't really matter compared to the bigger, more serious habits on this list. I don't think that's true at all. If anything, I think this 8th thing is the load-bearing one, the one holding all 7 of the others up. You can know your exact net worth and still quit after 4 months if the number moves too slowly to feel like anything. You can start a regret log and abandon it after 3 weeks if nothing about doing it ever feels rewarding. The only reason any of the first 7 things on this list survive long enough to compound into something real is that the person doing them found some way to make the process itself feel worth continuing, long before the destination arrived. Every single woman on my list, without exception, had figured out her own version of that, some small, private way of letting the boring, ordinary progress count for something on the very same day it happened, instead of waiting for a future moment that might have taken years to arrive. This week, and really going forward, I want you to actually notice and let yourself feel good about the small wins. Not perform them for anyone else. Just let yourself register that they count, because over enough time, they're the only thing that actually adds up to anything at all. I think about that woman from preschool pickup a lot, the one with the cracked taillight and the paid-off house who never mentioned either fact like it was anything worth mentioning. For a long time, I assumed she'd started from somewhere I hadn't, some advantage the rest of us didn't get, some head start built in before I ever met her. What I've actually come to believe, 30 names into this list, is that she probably just started doing these 8 boring things a few years before I did, on purpose, without ever making a production out of any of it. That's genuinely the whole difference, as far as I can tell. Not luck, not some hidden inheritance, not a bigger income than the rest of us. Just 8 quiet decisions, repeated long enough that they stopped being decisions at all and just became who she was. I think about how differently I would have reacted to this whole idea a few years ago, before I started the list, before any of this. I think I would have wanted a bigger answer than this. Something more dramatic. Something that felt like it deserved the gap between how she looked and what she apparently had. A secret account. A wealthy relative nobody talked about. Some early advantage that let me off the hook for not having gotten there myself yet. It's a strange kind of relief, and a strange kind of discomfort both at once, to look at 30 real people and find nothing there but ordinary decisions, made early and repeated often, by people who mostly didn't consider themselves remarkable at all. Relief, because it means none of this was ever actually out of reach. Discomfort, because it means the only thing standing between where I was and where they already were was time I hadn't spent yet on things I hadn't started yet. I don't say that to make you feel behind, because I've felt behind enough times myself writing this list to know exactly how unhelpful that feeling is. I say it because I think it's the most honest thing I can tell you after a year of quietly collecting these stories. None of these 30 women were extraordinary. They were mothers and former coworkers and neighbors, and a mother-in-law of a cousin I only see at holidays. Ordinary people living ordinary lives who happened to know 8 things the rest of us were never taught, and who started acting on that knowledge earlier than most of us do. That's the whole story. It was never going to be more dramatic than that, and honestly, I've come to find something genuinely comforting in how undramatic it actually is. Because undramatic things are things any of us can actually start doing, starting today, without waiting for some bigger moment that may never come. So here's all 8 of them again, laid out plainly. Knowing your real net worth, not just your income. Negotiating the small, ordinary things most of us never think to ask about. Treating your own time as something with a real dollar value. Choosing being wealthy over looking wealthy, even when nobody's watching. Keeping a regret log instead of a budget you'll abandon in a month. Keeping one goal loud and public while everything else stays quiet. Building a small circle of people who'll talk about money honestly. And letting the small, boring wins count as much as the big ones. You don't need all 30 examples I collected. You just need to pick one of these 8 and start. The same quiet, unglamorous way every single person on my list did. So tell me, out of these 8, which one are you already doing without realizing it? And which one is the one you know you've been avoiding? Drop it in the comments because I genuinely want to know which of these turns out to be the hardest one for people to actually start, not just agree with. I'm Alora. This is the Finance Mom HQ. Raising kids and retirement funds. Go take care of both, and I'll see you in the next one.